Hello, I'm Selena Osuna, coordinator for the Institute for Humanities Research at Arizona State University. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome y'all to the third and final event of our scholarly series on hope and empowerment, where today we welcome author Pam Zhang and Professor Julian Lim. Before we get started, I want to extend gratitude to those who have made this event possible. Thank you to our co-sponsors of this event, the Virginia G. Piper Writing Center and the Asian Pacific American Studies Program, especially Dr. Karen Kuo, who hosted a lit salon about Pam's novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold, earlier this month. Thanks also to our IHR team, our behind-the-scenes moderator today, Lauren Whitby, who's our Communications Specialist Senior, to Ron Brolio, Associate Director of the IHR, and to Liz Grumbach, Assistant Director of the IHR, without whom this series would not exist. Thanks also to Joe Carter of Livestream Success, who's running our streams today. You may notice that the chat has been disabled on Zoom, and please feel free to ask your questions for our speaker at any time by using the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom window, or by commenting on YouTube, and our moderators will relay them to our hosts today. The scholarly series on hope and empowerment came out of a recognized need to center and amplify voices in scholarship that do the work of hope and empowerment. Rather than pose the question, what can the humanities do? This is a platform for engaging with what the humanities are doing: activism, art, community work, storytelling. It's an honor for me to introduce Professor Julian Lim, an associate professor of history at Arizona State University. She holds a bachelor's degree in literature and a law degree from UC Berkeley, and has received her doctorate in history from Cornell University. She's trained in history and law, and she focuses on immigration, borders, and race, and has taught in both history department and law school settings. Her first book, Porous Borders, Multiracial Migrations and the Law in the US-Mexico Borderlands, has earned several awards, including the Outstanding Achievement in History from the Association for Asian American Studies, an honorable mention for the Theodore Saludos Memorial Book Award for the Best Book on US Immigration History, and our very own IHR Humanities Book Award last year. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Lim.
Thank you, Selena. I really appreciate that introduction. In turn, it's my pleasure to introduce Pam Zhang. Pam was born in Beijing, but describes herself as mostly an artifact of the United States. She's the author of this beautiful and powerful book, How Much of These Hills is Gold, which came out earlier this year and which has already received a great deal of praise and applause from literary critics and other authors. And the book itself was longlisted for the Booker Prize, as well as being a finalist for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Pam's writing appears in The Cut, McSweeney's Quarterly, The New Yorker, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and elsewhere. She's also a National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree. It's an amazing record considering that Pam only decided to take up writing actively and seriously as a living like 5 years ago. And I have so many questions about this process of writing and the research that went into it, because there are so many rich historical themes that Pam taps into. I won't be able to get into all of my questions today, but I'm looking forward to learning more about the book from Pam's perspective. The book itself starts as a gripping tale of two young Chinese American siblings who find themselves orphaned in a US West that has, in many ways, been ravaged by the gold rush. And these two kids, Lucy and Sam, basically have to figure out where and how to bury their father and survive on their own. It's a page turner that immediately draws you in, not only because of the way the story opens, but also because of the ways in which Pam plays with and upends a lot of our popular imaginings of the Old West. The themes of home and the past and land and belonging weigh heavily throughout the book, and the blending of Western tropes with Chinese American symbolism was so rich and evocative in an almost surreal way at times. And the story of the family at the center of it all was completely riveting. So I really encourage everyone in the audience to read it if you haven't yet. It'll make a great holiday gift. But to give you a small peek into the book, I'm going to pass the mic to Pam now for a little bit and let her share from the book herself.
Thank you so much, Julian and Selena, for those wonderful introductions, and thank you to everyone at Arizona State University who made this possible and for having me. Given that this is a series about hope and empowerment, I wanted to speak just a little bit about what that means to me in the process of writing this book. I know that probably many of you have felt, as I felt in the last couple of years, disempowered by and disappointed in a lot of our institutions, a lot of our systems, a lot of our sort of cultural myths and understandings. This feeling wasn't one that was new to me, though it did feel more intense over the last couple of years. I remember as a young child who grew up for a large part of my childhood in the American West, reading all these tales of that landscape by John Steinbeck, by Larry McMurtry, by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I loved these books. I loved how they took these small, mundane families, these small concerns, and by setting them up against this beautiful backdrop, they made you feel that the mundane and the ordinary could be epic, that these stories deserve to be told in this grand way. But as I grew up and as I read more of the predominantly white male literary canon, I began to feel that I didn't see anybody like myself or my family or my experiences reflected in that canon. I felt disempowered by that lack. And there were years when I despaired. There were years when I didn't know how to find my own writing voice and wrote a kind of pale imitation of the sort of middle-class white suburban stories that I encountered in my own education. And then I thought, well, if these stories about people like me don't exist, I do have the power to create them. So that's where this book was born. It is both a love letter to these Westerns of the Western canon, and it is also a sort of a repudiation. It's a little bit of an act of defiance on my part, to put people like myself and my family in this world and to use the page to interrogate these questions that have plagued me all my life, but which I didn't really see in literature, these questions of belonging to the land, of citizenship, of being an immigrant and a child of immigrants, of being caught between places and caught between identities and having identity thrust upon you. So with that, I'm going to read just a few minutes from the book itself. You don't really need to know much about this portion. As Dr. Julian Lim said, it follows these two children, and one of them, Lucy, is reflecting at the end of her journey about her connection to the landscape and what it means to her and her family. Lucy thinks of the other direction, the hills where she was born and the sun that bleaches sky and brightens grass. She thinks about when she stood in a dead lake and held what men desired and died for. She thinks that was nothing, really, compared to the way the noonday sun makes the grass blaze, horizon to horizon, a shimmer. Who could truly grasp it? The huge and maddening glint, the ever-shifting mirage, the grass that refused to be owned or pinned, but changed with every angle of light. What that land was, and to whom, death or life, good or bad, lucky or unlucky, countless lives birthed and destroyed by its terror and generosity. And wasn't that the real reason for traveling? A reason bigger than poorness and desperation and greed and fury. Didn't they know, low in their bones, that as long as they moved and the land unfurled, that as long as they searched, they would forever be searchers and never quite lost? There is claiming the land, which Ba wanted to do, which Sam refused. And then there is being claimed by it, the quiet way. A kind of gift in never knowing how much of these hills might be gold. Because maybe if you only went far enough, waited long enough, held enough sadness pooled in your veins, soon you might come upon a path you knew. The shapes of rocks would look like familiar faces. The trees would greet you, buds and birdsong lilting up. And because this land had gouged in you, an animal's kind of claiming, senseless to words and laws, dry grass drawing blood, a tiger's mark in a ruined leg, ticks and torn blisters, wind-coarsened hair, sunburned in patterns to leave skin striped or spotted. Then, if you ran, you might hear on the wind or welling up in your own parched mouth, something like and unlike an echo, coming from before or behind, the sound of a voice you've always known, calling your name. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Pam. And there's so much that I would love to unpack there, and I'm thrilled that that's actually the selection that you chose for sharing with the audience, because my first question had to do with location and land, and this connection to the land. So something that's struck me as I came to this book is the way in which your own personal journey is presented to the public, and then what seems like a kind of rootedness about Lucy and Sam, but especially Lucy in this particular world that you've built in the book. So more specifically, what I mean is that whether it's in, for example, the wonderful New York Times review of your book, or on your own website, or on the inside of the slipcover of the book, where for your bio it reads, born in Beijing, but mostly an artifact of the United States, right? C. Pam Zhang has lived in 13 cities across 4 countries and is still looking for a home. There's this sense of you as in constant migration and movement, as not particularly attached to any location, still looking for a sense of home and perhaps rootedness. But at the same time, the young protagonists in the book itself, and actually their parents as well, have a pretty strong sense of home, of where home is for them. And what I found really powerful about your book, in addition to the story of these human characters, is the role of the US West itself, right? In some ways, I read it as a kind of love story to the West. Even though I was never really exactly sure where they were, there's something about the way you describe their attachment to the lands, the hills and mountains, the rocks and trees, that evoked for me a very powerful connection to a literal physical space in the US West. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, am I imagining that? Or perhaps another way of asking the question is, how did you decide after being in so many different places and not necessarily feeling, it doesn't sound like particularly attached to one or another, how did you decide to locate this story here, not somewhere else in the US or in the world, right? Is there something particularly powerful about that pulled you to the West, the US West? And if so, what is that and why?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question, and it's such a careful reading of the novel, so I'm very honored by that. I think that the easiest way to start answering this question is honestly, I didn't decide. I feel like, we were talking a little bit earlier, I feel like what happens often with fiction writers is we have no idea what's going on with our work until way later when it's done or drafted or other eyes have sort of come into the conversation to help us understand what we're driving at. So the story of this novel is that I actually wrote it while I was living outside of the US. I was living for a year in Bangkok. It was sort of this gap year I had taken for myself where I had come to a juncture in my professional life. I had a different career as a day job. And I was like, either I'm going to write, I'm going to try out writing, like fully step into it, or I'm not, or I'm not. And this is where my life may diverge. So I went at it and I was writing short stories for a good period of time. And then one day I wrote this short story and it came to me in the way most short stories do, which is just like as an image, as a first sentence, as like an idea of 2 people. And I wrote it, and it wasn't until I finished that I realized I was writing in a sort of mythologized way, in a sort of impressionist way about the American West, about Northern California, where I spent so many of my formative years. And I think that I still, in some sense, don't understand exactly what I'm trying to say about my own autobiographical relationship to this landscape. I think that too often, I think that novels are, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but are sometimes simplified in the cultural conversation as they have a moral, they have a point. You read them and you take away some kind of like one sentence or one paragraph message. But I think I really resist that. I think something that I have felt very empowering in my own writing is to put uncertainty on the page, but put it on the page in an articulate way so that all these feelings I've had all my life of, displacement, rootedness, not quite sure where I belong, of being tugged in multiple directions. I don't have to have an answer, but there's something powerful about putting those questions on the page. And I think ultimately what any writer hopes for with their work is that a reader will encounter it and see something in it that is true to their own lives and feel that kind of reflection. It's funny because there's this idea that first novels are often directly autobiographical. And obviously I did not live in the 1800s and did not, ride horses and see buffalo. But at the same time, I do think that feeling is deeply autobiographical.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, so this picks up on something that you had mentioned earlier when you were introducing the reading. But I kind of want to go back to it and elaborate on it a little bit more, which is the ways in which you wanted to, or the ways in which the novel upends our traditional kind of normal understandings of the Old West, right, and of this 19th century West. And can you walk us through, the extent to which you went into the project wanting to upend those notions, those usual notions, or did that come kind of organically later on, right? Like, how did that process work?
Yeah, I think that as a writer, I've always loved writing both into and against tropes. I read a lot of fantasy, science fiction, westerns, like genre fiction when I was growing up, which is kind of used to be a sort of no-no in the literary world. But nowadays, I think we're seeing this trend where a lot of writers are sort of straddling those lines between literary and what is traditionally considered genre fiction. And I think the great joy of that is because these genres exist for a reason, right? They exist because they're very compelling, the sort of worn grooves of this kind of storytelling. They just like work in our minds, we get them. And so I think what's really delightful is, as a writer, if you have something fresh to say, to use those kinds of grooves against and for your reader to sort of like lure them into this world, and then from there change something about it, show something new about it. And so the novel wouldn't have been possible without my sort of unfortunate love for cowboy poetry, that sort of like slangy, like hard men speaking to one another diction that you see in old Western movies and old Western books. So that was sort of like one place of creativity that I started from. But I also wanted to, rupture that a little bit. So something I was really interested in the voice of this book was, I have this character, Sam, who would today, if they existed in 2020, probably identify as either trans or non-binary. But in the world of the novel, that's not possible. That's not authentic to the world of the novel, where Sam, who is born female and dresses as a boy, is often misgendered, even by the people that Sam loves the most. And so I had this conflict where, as a writer, I both wanted to be authentic to the world of the novel, but I also wanted to let Sam be seen for who they are, right? So that also made its way into the grammar and the original shaping of the novel, where for the first, I believe, something like 15 pages, I avoided the use of gendered pronouns. So Sam gets a chance to be seen by the reader the way they present themselves, which is, wearing this bandana, wearing these clothes, and the reader believes that Sam is a boy until the moment that is sort of flipped in the narrative. And so like twisting those two things together, this like cowboy slang, which creates its own delightful, like kind of like bumpy syntax, and then removing gendered pronouns from that syntax to create something that was both evocative of Westerns, but also new and fresh that I could use as a tool, was just like one example of, I think, what's wonderful about taking something from an existing genre and twisting it.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is hard because I think there is a tendency, at least on my part, you said, that you don't necessarily intend for everything to have the kinds of meanings that we might, or the political meanings that we might take away from it, or, that there's some uncertainty that you're working through in these works. And so, I was going to ask a question about Sam and playing with these gender and sort of sexual identity questions later on, but since you brought it up, I want to know, I'm trying to think about how to frame it. What is there about, I guess, can you speak more about those assumptions and why you wanted to throw those assumptions upside down, about why gender and sexuality were important for you to address in this way in this story?
Yeah, I think that the answer may be a little unexpected, but as I referenced earlier, before I worked on this novel, I had this full-time career in tech. And when I joined the first company I worked at out of undergrad, I was encountering sexism in ways that were strange to me and in shapes that I didn't sometimes even fully understand until years later. And so while that was happening in 2020, and though the book is happening sometime in the 19th century, I was just really interested in this question of gender bias, of misogyny, and how women historically through the ages have both understood their disempowerment and also use their femininity as a kind of a tool against the patriarchy, right? Against dominant society. What I mean by that is I sometimes hesitate because I think that when you oversimplify this, people are like, oh yeah, women are like empowered because they can, right, get men to buy them drinks and they have doors open for them. And I'm like, no, that's obviously not equal. And any woman would rather actually have pay parity and real power, right? But at the same time, there were many periods in history and actually many parts of the world still where femininity is the only tool that a woman or, a non-cis male can use. And so Sam is perhaps the most obvious use of that. Sam is very canny because they have to be about the ways in which they dress, in which the ways they talk, in which the activities that they choose to do can radically shape the way the world sees them and radically shape the sort of tools and powers that they're allowed to wield. But also the other female characters in the book use it in very different ways. You know, the mother figure, Ma, is also wielding her femininity to her own advantage and oftentimes to her children and her family's advantage. And it's something that Lucy, the other main character, sort of learns along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the character of Ma is someone that stays with me. It's constantly with me just because, again, this is another maybe spoiler. I mean, she is dead, right? But she's so present, right? And it's not necessarily that she's a ghost, but she's just shaping so much of the story, even though she's absent, physically absent, right? And so the way in which you center Chinese women, right, in the story about this Old West and kind of upend our usual notions about the Old West in that way as well is just really kind of, I found really powerful. So actually, which segues into my next question, which was that, what I found really striking about the book was not only that it disrupted these Western history and myths, but also how it disrupted the usual historical framing of Chinese immigration during the 19th century, which has tended to center Chinese men. And if there are Chinese women, they're frequently associated with these debates about prostitution, and then children hardly figure at all in any of the historical accounts, or very few. And again, this is not a huge spoiler, but it does get into some character development questions. So if there's any member of the audience who hasn't read the book yet and wants to keep the plot points fresh, you might want to plug your ears at this point. But especially during the period setting of this novel, those of Chinese descent would have been seen or usually depicted as newly arrived immigrants, right? Very foreign, very culturally different. And so I was struck by your choice to make Ba one of the earliest Chinese in the West who arrived before the gold rush, was essentially cut off from his Chinese roots and is raised by Billy and among other Native Americans. And then they have these two young characters who defy all these stereotypes about the Chinese during this time. So I was wondering if you could walk us through the process by which you decided to create these characters in these ways. Are they supposed to be American, Chinese, both, neither? Can you kind of...
Yeah, I'm so glad we're talking about this. I mean, I think the real question is like, I don't know. And like that confounds me and it confounds the characters and it confounds all the people for the most part in the novel who encounter them, because I think it is such a difficult question. What does it mean to be Chinese or Chinese American or American, but to have a face that the majority of people are going to read as Chinese? I think that, the book is definitely a story about immigration because some of their parents are immigrants. But I think maybe what it is even more about is a story about being the children of immigrants, right? About being stuck in this kind of third place between two cultures. I don't know if you've actually, any of you listening have heard the term third culture kid. which just refers to this. It's either people who are, children who are born in one culture of which their parents were not originally a part, or, grew up, were born in another culture, but then moved at an early age and just feel caught between that space. And I just don't think there is an easy answer to those kinds of questions of belonging. Just going to do a quick side shout out to this really wonderful book that came out this year called Minor Feelings. It's a nonfiction book by Kathy Hong Park. And one of the things it does so brilliantly that really, I think, resonates with many of the themes in my book is to wonder at what it means to be Asian American. Like, how can you ever hope to see all these different people, first generation, second generation, 1.5 generations from different cultures as a monolith? And yet, a lot of the times, that's what we're seen as, I think of even, right, the anti-Asian racism that's erupted in this country as a result of so much, the president and so much of his administration calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. And that's horrible, but what's also really fascinating and just like really dark about that is many of the people who suffered violent hate crimes as a result of this like anti-Chinese sentiment aren't even Chinese, right? They're Korean, or they're Korean American, or they're Japanese, or what have you. And I think that's one of the like special frustrating walls that Asian Americans will always run up against in this country, because like regardless of what the truth of it is, the truth of your citizenship or your place of birth or your cultural identity, in some senses, it doesn't matter, right? All the hundreds of years, I have friends who are like 6th generation Japanese American, but all of that can be erased in an instant because people will sometimes see your face and make an assumption. And so I wanted my book to capture some of the slipperiness of that. And so I don't really have an answer.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I mean, it's a very thorough, kind of detailed explanation of how you engage with that kind of question or these issues of belonging and identity. And this actually reminds me of a quote that I saw that actually something that you wrote in the New Yorker piece that I came across, and which I thought really actually beautifully encapsulated the essence of this book as well and its powerful story. You wrote there in the New Yorker piece, there are among us in America this very day buying their groceries and paying their car insurance and scolding their children and walking their dogs, millions of Chinese and Mexican and Colombian and Vietnamese immigrants and refugees who should be read as large as any Greek hero. They are survivors of famine and war, desert crossings and night bombings. They choose to live quietly. They minimize their origins and speak mostly of their children, the real heroes, these immigrants believe, of stories that take 2 generations to tell. So what's interesting is, in some ways, yes, there are particularities of not just the story of this specific family that you're creating, but the particularities of Chinese American history, right? Within this broader Asian American history and identity that we think of or talk about, and then beyond that, there's this broader kind of immigrant kind of category as well. But so even despite these potentially dividing markers, I actually found there's still so much that resonated as real to me. So I'm Korean American. I was born and raised in California. But just some of this debate about whether we belong and how that gets played out in the family, as well as the role of the past, right? And that's something I wanted to ask you about is the role of the past in your understanding of hope and future and empowerment. Like it's interesting that you reached back into a past, right, into a history to do this. And so there's two parts to this question. One is kind of process question, which is how much historical research did you do for this book, and at what point? Was it before you started or during, or the second question is what, and actually before I explain this, part of what really resonated with me about the family's engagement with the past was that the parents never talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, my parents never talked, they still very rarely talk about the past. There's just so much pain, right?
Yeah.
And so, but the past can is sort of necessary at the same time, right? To kind of release and let the families move forward, the Lucy and Sam. And so, what role does the past do you think have in kind of hope and empowerment and the future? Um, yeah, those are my two questions.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I think that at different stages in my life, I would have given very different answers to that question. Definitely when I was younger, I had sort of this rashness where I was like, oh, it doesn't matter about the past. It doesn't matter what my parents went through. All that matters is like the future, America, opportunity, me. It's like this kind of, it was actually a very, I guess, like American rugged individualism sort of philosophy, right? And something I write about in that New Yorker essay, which is something I really only understood in maybe even the past couple of years, the older I've grown, is that for so many of us, there is this generational fracture, but also, as you've said, for so many immigrants, there's also this cultural fracture where we don't understand where our parents come from, and maybe there's something to the fact that they don't, because they live in a different culture, there aren't all these reminders that would maybe prompt the kind of storytelling that we might otherwise get. But um, what's really difficult about that, I think, then is that you don't see your parents as, it is harder to see your parents as full people, to really understand the complexities of why they made these decisions, why they ended up where you are. It's much easier to sort of, as I certainly did when I was younger, kind of villainize your parents, right? See, not understand the root of certain decisions they make that you may not agree with. Um, and I think that just like and so that's on a personal level. I think it is really important to be able to embrace your family and embrace its past and all its horrors and complexities and also delights in order to truly see them. But I think that also on a cultural level, sort of speaking to the first part of your question, I think that we are living in, I hesitate to call it an age because in some sense, I think this has always been true of America, but we're living in this age of cultural historical amnesia. I'm sure you feel this very strongly as an actual historian, but for example, because I went through the California public school system for a number of years, I did have this kind of broad brushstrokes idea of the gold rush and the presence of Chinese immigrants. So when I began the book, because I was sort of writing in this subconscious rush, I didn't go out and do research right away. I kind of like created this world. And then when I had a draft ready, then I went back and sort of did research, checked dates, read books like this really wonderful book called Asian American Dreams by the scholar Helen Zia. And was, sorry, to rewind a bit. So I remember when I finished the first draft of the book, I was a little bit shocked and horrified by what I had written. I thought that some of the depictions of violence and racism in the book, because I wrote it in 2015, found them too maudlin. I was like, oh man, I guess we've moved past this as a country. Is this like too much? Is it going to read as histriotic and like just melodramatic? And then obviously 2016 happened, the election happened. I did more research into the past, and it was like eerie to see how many sort of resonances there were between historical acts of violence against Chinese laborers and the acts of violence I depicted. Oftentimes history is even more brutal and horrifying, but these weren't things I learned about in school, and these weren't the things that many of us learned about in school. And that's not just true, obviously, of the Chinese American experience. It's true of so many experiences. I think last year, because of several HBO shows, was the first time so many Americans had heard of like the Tulsa massacres, right? Which were just like such a huge historical moment that was then like sort of, maybe buried is too strong. It actually probably isn't too strong, but like buried over, painted over, right? I think America does have this tendency to want to look forward, sometimes at the expense of looking backwards, but it is the looking backward that sort of like keeps us safe. I think that's become really apparent in this year when, for example, we've seen all these references to like, the flu of 1918 and how actually that closely mirrors a lot of what's been happening this year with the coronavirus. And maybe if we had the wisdom to sort of lean on that historical experience, we would have benefited from it. But it's just a really, really long roundabout way of saying that something that I'm sure you agree with, which is like the historical record is really important. We gloss over a lot of it. And I think we often gloss over like the ickier parts of it in America, so much so that I kind of think that at least in the K to 12 education system, a lot of what is taught as history is more like mythology, honestly, in terms of like how much there's a definitive narrative, how much is stripped away, how much is sort of like airbrushed, right? I spent some of my childhood living in Lexington, Kentucky, and I distinctly remember the history lessons there being about how Kentucky wasn't really part of the South, right? And yeah, so American mythology is very strange and also very troubling.
Yes, that's a really kind of compelling way to put it, right? Mythology, exceptionalism. Yes, there's.
I feel like we could talk for 5 hours about this. I can see your historian feels.
Yeah, I'm like it's getting like stuck because there's just so many things firing right now. But on the note of doing that research and coming across and kind of verifying and learning more, were there any details or historical facts that you did come across that you decided to ignore or actually reject for the sake of your narrative? And so I'm always curious for writers who are not pure historians or whatever, right? Doing kind of more fictional creative works. How do you balance that between the need to have a story that's driving the narrative versus sort of accuracy?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one, major event in the book that deviates from the historical record is it's a very small spoiler, but in the book, right, one of the members of the main family finds like the first piece of gold, like before the actual first discovery of gold in California. And so that was both a deliberate deviation from history, but also kind of, again, an act of defiance, where I think that one thing that's really interesting about the record is I started to think a lot about the difference of the job of, the writer of fiction and the historian, where I think it's absolutely necessary that our modern historians continue to do the work of trying to excavate stories that have been sort of like partially lost or hidden in the past, but also to acknowledge that, if we go back as far as the 1800s, there are stories that were erased or lost or glossed over or just discounted that will never, ever again come to light. There are huge erasures. And I think one of the roles of the fiction writer is to imagine, through an act of empathy, through an act of craft, to imagine into these erasures and bring back stories that may have been lost. And maybe they're not fact for fact, the exact stories, but I think there is an emotional truth in them that needs to be saved through fiction, through television, through these other narrative mediums that we have.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm glad that you brought up these points because they actually provide a great platform for my next question, which actually is also building on a question that came through the Q&A box. And so I hope you don't mind if I'm going to put on right now my more kind of critical historian's hat and ask you a slightly different question about your relationship to the U.S. West and its mythologies. It's going to take a little longer maybe to get to the question, but just bear with me. So what I, and of course many others, love about the book is the way it takes these classic Western tropes and plays with them in all the different kinds of ways that we've already sort of touched on. It even takes this idea about manifest destiny and westward expansion and reverses it, right? As Lucy and Sam are moving more and more inland, and Lucy's gaze always seems to be towards the interior of the continent and the east, actually. And by placing Lucy at the center of the story, you help us to see a much more multiracial and multidimensional West than in those conventional tales. And so, as you said, recovering those lost histories, they're not even lost, they're erased histories, right? From the stories that have been erased from dominant narratives is a very powerful, defiant act that you're doing. And recovering some of those lost histories or erased histories is something that I've tried to do myself in my own research. And so in my first book, I looked at the migrations of diverse groups to the US-Mexico borderlands during the late 1800s. And I was interested in exploring the region as a much more dynamic and heterogeneous space. But something that I worry about now was that in the process of focusing on the experiences of migrants, that I did not fully address the native peoples who had made those lands their homes for millennia. And so I risked myself erasing indigenous peoples from the land and potentially reproducing that ongoing violence of manifest destiny and westward expansion by settler colonists, right? That violence, of course, the erasure of Native peoples from our narratives about the region, even as Native nations continue to exist and resist and shape the region into our day, right? Thinking about the power of the Native vote in Arizona just recently. So, so one of the things I found immediately interesting about your book was that opening epigraph, "This land is not your land." And I immediately thought, like, awesome, the author is opening with an indigenous point of view. But then it became kind of clear that it's not an indigenous perspective, it's perhaps the voice of Ma. Um, there's a page towards the middle of the book where you say, where Ma says, "This will never be our land." And I thought that was kind of an echo of that epigraph. And then in the end, Lucy seems to say, "No, this is my land." And she aligns herself and her sense of home with Ba's vision of the land much more than we might have imagined at first. And so this is going to be maybe a hard question, and it might be an unfair one. And if so, just you can tell me to move on. But as a historian of the West, I'm curious about your choices in engaging or not engaging Native history. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's a great question. It's definitely something I thought about a lot in the process of writing this book. So, to just like give some book context, right? I guess the main character, the narrator, is Lucy, who is Chinese American. And one of the things that I really wanted to show through her character was the danger of this idea, this incorrect idea of assimilation she has as a Chinese American, which is something that I think a lot of Asian Americans even today experience. It's this model minority myth, this idea that like if you uphold whiteness and fold yourself into whiteness, you will be seen as white or adjacent to white enough that you can, derive all the power of that position. And as I worked on this book, I realized that was a really, really important theme I wanted to hit upon. And so it sort of got into the same creative area as my decision to, sometimes have characters misgender Sam. It was that battle between the desire to present an authentic world, even especially if that world is gritty and problematic and characters say things that I don't personally agree with, and the desire to really, show Native people, show transgender people in the light in which they deserve. Ultimately, I decided that this was not my job from my lived experience and through this character was to show the harmful, toxic effects of this desire for assimilation in an Asian American character. So that Lucy, she does change her views a little bit over the course of the book, but she, as the white society does, often looks down on Native peoples. But at the same time, what the book does also show is that she is destroyed by this toxicity. It hurts her as much. I don't want to say as much, but it hurts her as well as hurting, right, the actual downtrodden Native peoples in this book. And I wanted to show that on the page. I thought it was important to show the harmful effects on her and the rest of society. And then the other thing I will say is that, I think that it is dangerous when writing fiction always to try to write a morally perfect book, because then it loses all of what makes fiction wonderful, right? Which is so much of which is like this battling of morality and identity and questioning on the page. And so what I'll say to that is what I see this book doing is I don't want it to be the definitive story of the West, just as I didn't want to have a world in which like Larry McMurtry is the definitive story of the West. What I really want is, I hope we're entering this landscape where there are many newly definitive stories of the West. And I, for one, am like starving for sort of, stories by Native writers of Native peoples in the West. But at the same time, that isn't my story to write. And all I can do is try to, create the change I can in the literary culture, in the systems to help those stories come to life. But they're not my stories. I want them to sit side by side with mine.
Okay, I appreciate that fair and thoughtful response. I think it does speak to these really important, bigger questions about who can belong to this land and claim that land that you're really grappling with in the book and presenting for readers. So I really do appreciate this. Appreciate that. There are questions that I think are coming in that I do want to get to from that are being curated from the audience. But before we do that, I am going to put on my big fan hat again and ask a kind of spoiler type question. But again, this is a testament to how invested I became in your book, in your story, and in the characters and how powerful your writing is. And so I don't know that you have an answer to this, but um, what happens to Sam after the book ends, right? Does Lucy ever hear from Sam again? Do the siblings ever reunite? And where's Ma?
Yeah, very good questions. I am going to say I don't have an answer to them in my head, but I'm going to on the spot attempt to put together what I think. I mean, I guess like backing up for a moment, I think that like for me as a reader, one thing I have always loved about novels is the kind of novel where you feel like your characters go on to live full lives after the book has been closed, that they're not sort of like so cleanly, their stories are not so cleanly finished that there's no room for the reader's imagination. So that was something I strove to write in this book. So I'm like glad that it incited those kinds of questions in other people. I would say that I don't actually see Lucy or Sam or Ma reuniting at any point. One, the world is very large, and I think by the end of the novel, all three of them have such different views of the world, such different things that they're seeking, that it doesn't actually make sense for them to sort of come back together as a family unit in that way. And I think that particularly for Lucy, I think that the arc of a novel is very different from the arc of an actual character's life. And I think that Lucy, the arc of her for this novel, we talked a little bit about this assimilation and this sort of like toxic hatred for non-white people and self-hatred that she has. I think that in some sense, the arc of the novel is Lucy sort of seeing that in herself for the first time and beginning to acknowledge that. And I think the next arc of her life is deciding what she wants to do now that she's acknowledged that. What does she do with that power? What does she do with that information? And I do think that is a very individual journey for her, at least in that next stage, and it's probably something that she embarks upon on her own. As for Ma, I hope that Ma is happy somewhere. I think that she is like a character that was really fun to write, because I think that always in literature, one of the most difficult types of characters to portray is the mother who gives up being a mother, who sort of performs that cardinal sin of unmothering. But I think that Ma is this fascinating character where she doesn't really live with the kind of guilt that society usually puts on women who make that kind of decision. So I like to think of her as living a very happy, fulfilled life, doing something that she wants to do. And as for Sam, I think that's the biggest question in my mind. I'm not really sure what Sam does, but Sam is doing things their own way.
Awesome, thank you.
So give you any closure.
It does. Well, I don't need closure. I just kind of wanted more. Like I just wanted more. Yeah. Okay. So there's a question that came in that is. So I'm just going to read it. So would you be willing to talk about the words that start each section? For example, mud, salt, water, skull. The ways in which you have titled each chapter. It seems like the land and its elements are not only haunting Sam and Lucy, but are very active and alive throughout the novel.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love talking about this because it's really, for me, a craft question. I'm going to try to hold up my book. I don't know if it'll work with my lighting. Okay. Oh, you can see this. So what Dr. Lim is referring to is the fact that there are 4 sections of the book, and in all but one of the sections, these chapter titles repeat, but in different orders. So words like gold, plum, salt, skull, etc., like come back over and over again. These didn't exist in the first draft of the book. They actually came in really late when I was in the editing process. It was this stage where I had written the story, I knew where the story was going, but it was feeling kind of baggy, untidy, like threads were loose. And I wanted a way to tighten it and bring it back into a more coherent whole. And so I started to put these working chapter titles up above each chapter, and I thought I would get rid of them. The real goal was like, I will give each chapter a motif that in my head I will sort of aim for. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, the chapter title will literally show up or be like the big part of the chapter. It's just like some kind of mental North Star for me to work on. And then as I kept working on them, I discovered that I was using the same words over and over. And I realized that what this was actually doing for the book was it was cementing this idea of intergenerational trauma that I was trying to get at through all these sections, this idea that, just because you don't, as we talked about earlier, just because you don't talk about a problem, just because your parents pretend some traumatic element of their past didn't happen, doesn't mean that those emotions and those traumas don't resurface again and again and sort of get recycled in a new way in each generation. And I found it really useful to just keep the book tight in that way.
So yeah, no, I mean, I love the way in which you've organized the book and some of these sort of like sort of subtle and symbolic details, like the way you title the chapters, and they're kind of, you're playing with the organization of them and the order of them. And then there's part 3, which is just one, win, 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 win by itself. What does the wind? What is that supposed to evoke for the reader?
Yeah, I think for me, wind always has these associations of movement. Even if you yourself are not moving, it has these associations of progress. And especially in this sort of very large physical landscape of this book, it is a way in which emotions, feelings can travel faster than actual human locomotion allows for. I don't know if that's fully an answer, but those are all the sort of associations it has for me.
Okay, awesome. There's a question in the Q&A box that I wanted to bring up. So something that Pamela Stewart found important about the book is its focus on the thoughts, decision, experiences of quote unquote girls. I know it's more than that, and the girls can be limiting as a descriptor, but even Ma's experiences fit this category in many ways. And Sam has certainly at least assessed her status in that category. We see some of her decisions in that process. Placing the perspectives of children born female is not what the tropes she writes against and uses suggest, and sorry, I'm not sure if I followed that sentence fully, but she ultimately, the writer, the audience member is intrigued with the idea that the transgender, non-binary aspect may have allowed you to more deeply explore the life of girls and allowed you to use more traditional storylines in radically non-traditional ways. Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
I think I understand that. I think that's actually a very astute observation. And because Sam is exploring with her Sam is exploring their gender presentation, it does allow them to sort of like sit on this line where there are points in their life where they toggle between, female presenting and male presenting. And I think that Sam dancing across that line is a way to sort of more deeply explore that idea of gender and power in performance than if we only had characters who were always 100% of the time read as girls or read as women. So it was definitely like a really rich and powerful device to see the world through the eyes of this character who was born a girl but can sort of play with performance.
Right. So I've got a fairly basic and sort of selfishly motivated question about process and writing for you, because I'm always curious to see like how do other people produce and write, right? So do you have a pretty clear schedule for there are some folks who say you should write every day 30 minutes a day at least, and then you move on, or there are folks who just schedule one day a week and just that's all you do that day. Is there a routine that you have found works for you, and is there structure in your writing style?
No, that's the long and short of it for me personally. No, I've written everything. I've written differently. In this case, I started with a short story, which short stories I usually write in a number of days, and then I went away for a bit for like 6 months because it just kind of kept knocking at my head, and then because I had thought about the world for that long, the first draft came out really quickly in a number of consecutive weeks. But I don't know that will ever happen again. I think my biggest thing is, first of all, there's no writing schedule that works for everyone. So the best piece of advice for anybody who's looking for a way into their own schedule is to listen to nobody else's advice. Just do what makes sense. But I will also say that because I hear the advice about writing daily repeated so often, I think that is actually fairly harmful, because there's something that always irked me about that, and what I realized down the road was that it's actually a pretty deeply classist idea of writing. You know, I worked a day job for, I mean, still am working a day job for years, and for a lot of people, whether it's because they have work or they have children they need to care of, or parents or whatever, they can't sit down at a desk, you know, with a perfect view out the window and write for uninterrupted hours. And it's really not fair to sort of make people feel bad about not being able to do that, to make them feel like they're not a writer if they're not writing every day. I really do think we have to divest art and writing from this idea of productivity, which is, you know, it's a capitalist clock. Writing, art making is not a 9 to 5 endeavor. And what I've realized more and more over the years is that there is so much of living that itself filters into writing, right? Like experiencing the world, having conversations with your parents, going on hikes. Those are all things that in some loose way are writing just as much as, you know, sitting down and actually like typing on your keyboard or putting pen to page are writing. Those are all about experiencing the world and processing these emotions in a way that translates into the work that you finally do.
So if there's one, so we've been talking about writing, but reading is also obviously very important. If there's one book, I think there are a lot of students possibly in the audience. If there's one book that students have to read in their lifetime, what would it be?
Oh no, that's so hard.
If there's one book that I need to have read in my lifetime, what should that be?
Okay, it's such a, I feel like if people are going to think this is an overplayed answer, but it's also a true one, I'm going to say Beloved by Toni Morrison. It's just, I mean, for one, it's such an important book, but also like from a pragmatic perspective, if you're only reading one book, it's a book that I have literally read over a dozen times, and I find something new in it each time. On a personal level, I just like love her mastery of language, which I think is it's just fantastic. But also, it was a source of inspiration for this book in the sense that it's a book that has elements of the surreal. It's a book that centers women's experiences, and it's a book that sort of like takes, like, I think it's Toni Morrison was inspired by a true historical event, but then, you know, makes many deviations from it, including into the surreal. And I think it is, again, a book that teaches you how history erupts and interrupts everyday life, and how trauma is present for many people. And finally, how, yeah, you can deviate from the facts and just tell this really resonant emotional truth.
Yeah, no, I see that influence. I see the connections there. And so, uh, once again, you know, this is a beautifully written book, a really compelling story. I want to thank you so much for helping us to see these kinds of stories in the world, and for presenting it in such empowering language and sort of evocative imagery. I look forward to hearing more from you in the future. I would love, you know, to keep this conversation going, but we do have we have hit the almost the hour point. So I want to thank the audience for joining us today as well. And I am going to pass the mic back to Selena now. But again, thank you so much, Pam. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. This was really fun. I really appreciate you asking the tough questions. These are always the most intellectually engaging ones.
Thank you both. I'm also appreciative of the tough questions because I'm not the one having to answer them. But Pam, your answers and your transparency in terms of your craft and your process, like just thank you so much. It's engaging and inspiring, which I think, right, we want the Hope and Empowerment series to be about. Everything from learning about your background in tech and kind of having that fuel your writing, and I don't know, and then you're here with us today, and it's just been wonderful. And thank you so much, Dr. Lim, for facilitating this discussion, both from our audience and from your own readings into How Much These Hills is Gold. It's just been a pleasure. And I just want to extend thanks once again to our ground control team and our live stream expert, Joe Carter, for ensuring that everything kind of ran smoothly today. And to our audience, we really hope that you've enjoyed this series on hope and empowerment and that you do take good care in this time. And I know that I'll be returning to this discussion once it'll be live on YouTube as soon as we stop, but I know that I'll be returning because just the conversation was so rich and thoughtful. And I just really hope that you both know that. And we really appreciate that. So thank you both. I don't know if you have any closing words, but thank you both.
Read the book.
So just, yeah, again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Selena, Julian, and the crew, and everyone at ASU for having me. This was just like a really nice way to close out the week.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.